Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today's video is going to be a little different than what I normally do. To give just the background as to why, I'm interested in getting a dwarf reticulated python as a pet. And it'll be my first retic, and so I've got a lot of questions about this. And as it happens, one of probably the foremost breeder of dwarf and superdwarf reticulated pythons in the United States, and possibly the world, lives here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His name's Garrett Hartle, and he's the owner and main person in Reach Out Reptiles, specializing in dwarf and superdwarf reticulated pythons. So, he's got a YouTube channel called Reach Out Reptiles, which is popular and growing quickly. And so I've got a lot of questions. He's got a lot of videos that have a lot of information, but there are a lot of questions here just from the perspective of someone who knows nothing about them and just is wondering, like, what would I be getting myself into that I still had. And while it's really easy to find that Garrett is very generous with his time, just search his name on most social media sites and you'll find people saying that. But that only kind of works while there's a relatively small number of people in my position, and his channel's growing. The word about dwarf and superdwarf reticulated pythons is getting out, and so at some point there'll just be too many people in my position for the one Garrett Hartle to be able to put a lot of time into each person. And the other thing too, to be respectful of his time, because he's a business owner. This is how he supports his family. And so, his time is limited, but especially if you think about it, I'm looking to get one pet, and, I'm not that interested in spending, lots of money in order to get really fancy genetics, as most, potential pet owners probably would not be interested in. That's really more the domain of other people who want to breed dwarf and superdwarf reticulated pythons. And for them, it makes a lot of sense because they'll buy more than one snake. They'll buy the much more expensive snakes. But they're going to be in the relative minority, and as time goes on, this is going to the numbers will get worse and worse. And so I was thinking about this, and it occurred to me, well, what if I record when I ask him all the various questions that I have that will be pretty common questions for other people in that same sort of position of ignorance that I am, because when you don't know, you're going to have the same sort of basic questions. Individuals will vary, but so the result is, reached out to him, and he said he'd be willing to do it, and so he came over, and this video is that conversation. Lasts about an hour, as you can see from the time bar. There's a lot of really interesting things that Garrett said during it. I do want to mention this is not meant to be a replacement for the videos that Garrett has made. He's made lots of videos on the care of dwarf and superdwarf retics, and they're nice polished videos in sort of bite-sized chunks. We don't cover the same material, generally speaking, there as in this video. So this is, I'll be having links, in the description to his stuff. This isn't meant to replace that. So, without further ado, here's me asking beginner questions of what I'm getting into by getting a dwarf or superdwarf reticulated python, sort of how to go about it as somebody who doesn't know what he's doing there. I've got a ball python. I've kept a few snakes like that, ball python, corn snake, but as somebody who doesn't really know much of anything about reticulated pythons, what am I getting myself into? Here's that video. Hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed talking with Garrett. So, just to start off with what a superdwarf is, I sort of got the impression that they're kind of analogous to dog breeds. That like a mainland retic might be something like a Mastiff or a Great Dane. Okay. And then, dwarf and superdwarf being marketing terms that refer somewhat to localities, but basically like you then have some retics that are more like things like a greyhound or a whippet, and then even smaller, you'll have things that are from like some of the really, really tiny islands where they are naturally bred by small prey to just be really small. You get something that's a bit more like a miniature pinscher or something like that. Nothing like a teacup chihuahua. But that then when it comes to the subject of breeding, as soon as you start mixing these things, like what happens when you breed a miniature pinscher to a Great Dane? Well, all sorts of stuff. And so how is that as a description of what a dwarf and superdwarf reticulated python is?
Close. I think you have a few things in there that are commonly touted that I'm not sure we really know about. The first one is that they stay small on those superdwarf islands because of small prey size. Not sure that that's accurate. I don't think we know why they are small. There's a term for it scientifically. It's called the island effect. But generally, you see mammals on islands get small and reptiles get big. And so things like Komodo dragons being a giant varanid because of the island effect, a lizard has risen to become the top apex predator. These are not actually the apex predator of where they live. There are, there's big monitor lizards on a lot of those islands and things like that. So, I would certainly say they are a apex predator, but a lot like the big snake species we have here in the U.S., there's things that prey on them as well. So we don't know why entirely that they are so small. It probably is a combination of factors, harsh environment, possibly limited food, but it's not about shrinking them with food. It doesn't. Yeah. It's not that simple, and there's still a lot of studies to be done. The other thing about it is dwarf and superdwarf, like you said, it's correct. They are marketing terms, but they refer to a scientifically distinct subspecies of reticulated pythons, which is Malaya python reticulatus jampeianus. And currently the superdwarfs and dwarves are lumped together. Dwarves would be from places like Jampeia. The superdwarves would be like Madu, Kalatoa, Karompa. There's a few outlying islands that could be said to be in between, like a Kayawati or a Tombolongan is from another subspecies again. But they are on their own a distinct subspecies. So more than like a Chihuahua and a Great Dane, it's almost more like a fennec fox and a wolf, where they are naturally existing as they are. And then, the modern dog species that we have most likely came from a mix of different species over the years. I don't think they all came from one species of canid, So they are their own subspecies, and they used to all be one species, and people bred them together and everything. But now that they're scientifically starting to reclassify and branch off, they're finding the importance of the purity of the different locations and things. There are distinct differences and everything. So you have two different things. The superdwarf can mean anything from a pure animal to, the industry standard. If you want to have a mutation like this animal that I'm holding right here is a mochino tiger. She is a superdwarf, but in order to call her that, you have to maintain at least 50% of the superdwarf blood, or, at least a mix of those island localities. So she could have Madu or Kalatoa or whatever in her. This one happens to be Kalatoa. But yeah, so you can breed them and selectively breed between those to get those. So fairly accurate. I would just say, it may not be food alone that caused them to be small originally. I think we need to study that a little bit more, and more likely it's a combination of factors. And then, with the dog breeds, they've kind of reclassified monitored canids as all one species, which, I don't know how you go about doing that when you don't know the actual. So, like, if you wanted to call these all one species now because they're an in-between thing and they have been for a while, I suppose you can do it that way, but it doesn't seem very scientific when you start dealing with domesticated animals. And that's really what they are, is a domesticated reticulated python. The goal is to take all of the good qualities of a reticulated python that makes them interesting captives and breed out any of the bad qualities. So wolves are great because they're pack animals. They're bad because they like to eat things like us, right? So if you can make a dog that is a great pack animal and considers us part of their family, then you have a real winner there.
Yeah. No, to clarify, when I said small food, I was thinking more like once you're big enough to kill the widely available prey, there isn't much point in getting bigger, but then you need more food to support your bigger size.
Probably.
And so I meant that as like a selective breeding criteria that...
Yeah, it could be natural selection favored the smaller animals because they could do more with less.
Yeah, and they're big enough to kill everything you can kill on that small little island there.
Yeah.
Just as a theory. But that actually brings us to food. Because then you've got a video talking about how to feed it. And I'd like to give a wild oversimplification of what you said and see what you think of it. And that is basically what you advocate for the snakes you sell is basically feed them really well until they stop growing longer and start growing fatter, then pull back just until they stop growing fatter.
I think that's actually probably the best oversimplification I've ever heard. That's one of the big questions. How much do I feed my snake? And, the funny thing is a lot of times people have a goal of trying to make that snake fit them. I think that's the wrong goal from the beginning. So if you're trying to say, how much do I feed my snake so that it doesn't outgrow this cage I have it in or something? Yeah, that's no better than the guys in the 60s and 70s that would peddle baby American alligators at carnivals and say, put it in a 10-gallon cage and it'll never outgrow it, If you are trying to fit the animal around your lifestyle by manipulating diet and things like that, you have an entirely wrong philosophy on how to keep them. I think if you do it genetically, which is obviously much more difficult, takes years, but through selectively breeding animals that have ideal traits, so that the animal actually is and made and is meant to be what you want it to be, that's when you have that good fit. But yeah, a lot of times people want to say, how big of a food item, how often do I have to feed it, like it's a scientific formula. And every animal is different, every climate that they live in is different, and especially when you start getting, like this girl, like the crosses between pure super dwarves and mainland varieties, they have different growth rates, different sizes for the different bloodlines. So probably the best way is to go ahead and feed them well as they're growing, give them all the nutrition that they need. And then when you start to see the shape of their body change, snakes will usually pack fatty tissue on the last third first. Then they get it on their neck. They start to lose that neck. They look like they have a little pinhead with a big thick neck. You're moving towards obesity. You need to cut them back a little bit. So both of these animals have very good body types. If you looked at them in cross section, they would basically be more almost like a vertical rectangle. But you can see alongside the spine, there are two very strong, thick muscular like back straps in there of muscle. When you don't feed them enough, the spine will stick up and it'll always be sticking up in the center. See how when she flexes, the spine is indented? And you can see the flexing of the muscle on either side. So you don't want the spine showing, but you also don't want it to be looking like a stuffed sausage either. Where, I don't know if you noticed, but right where she is bending to curve, there's no chub lines or any of that, you know what I mean? Just these rippling sinews and muscles. That's what you want. If they start to get like fat rolls where they bend, you're getting a little bit of a pudgy animal. So
that makes sense. Now, I guess the next logical thing from a size perspective is sexual dimorphism. Now, in general, it's safe to say in general, reptiles, females are bigger than males, right? I mean, there are going to be exceptions, but at least in snakes, it's pretty common. Yeah,
I mean, there's still like Drymarchon and some things like that have larger males, I think. So there is a little bit of that.
But anyway, in retics.
Right. In retics, you generally hear that the females get bigger than the males.
Now, how much of a size difference would you say that is?
Well, a lot of the difference in the size between a male and a female comes in when she is trying to lay eggs. So it takes a lot of extra, energy out of the animal to lay a clutch. It's amazing. Some of these, especially these small snakes, if you look at them, this snake, for example, is a sexually mature adult female, and she is, less than a tenth the size of what a breeder mainland female would be. But the eggs she lay might only be half as big. So proportionally, they have very large eggs. And for them to push them out, they have to have very strong, muscular bodies, and it takes a lot of nutrients out of them. Usually these poor Superdwarf females, after they're done laying an egg, they look like a used gym sock you peeled off or something. Wow. They just look like they're going to die. They look terrible. They give everything to them. So what they'll do is the females, pack on and hold extra nutrients. And a lot of times that causes them to get girthier, a little bit longer than a typical male will. And when they're breeding, they expel that. Hi, baby. They seasonally they'll go through and burn that off and then put it back on and burn that off. But if you were just to keep them as a pet, a lot of times they're going to pack it on seasonally and then not burn it off. Whereas the males, they're very athletic, they're very mobile, they're always cruising around, especially during cooler weather. They'll want to get out and see if they can find some females, and so they have a higher metabolism. They burn that stuff faster, so they tend to be a little bit smaller.
Okay. And so, which sort of brings the next question about the temperament, because I mean, it's not that hard to find people talking about males being aggressive and on the internet or even in person in some cases. And so, but the aggression that's being talked about is something to do specifically with breeding or with breeding season or something like that.
Yeah, the problem even with the word aggression in animals is misused. I think we as people are very defensive, and there's this kind of innate thing where if an animal stands up against us, we feel like it is evil. You know what I mean? Bad, should be killed, or something like that. You know what I mean? If a mountain lion walked through your front yard and stared you down as it did, it would make you uneasy, and you would feel like that was a bad mountain lion. Like, that mountain lion should be afraid of you, right? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of what you hear is from, I mean, typically keepers are male, right? So you have guys like this, and these animals are intelligent enough to understand the difference between a human male and female. They'll even react differently to them. So in the very specific situation that a male retic is with a female retic during breeding season, actively breeding that animal, it does not want another male to be there, and it will defend her, sometimes very ferociously, so that you have to stay away. So if you're a male and you're pulling a male off of another female, they're going to be very defensive of their property they're claiming, because they want breeding rights to that female. They don't want you around. They don't want you in their territory. And so typically that's what you're going to see is that, they're very, usually very calm and calculated, and but they'll square up against you. Now, if an animal is hissing and, raising up, open mouth gaping, striking at you, a lot of times people go, oh my gosh, it must be breeding behavior or whatever. That's not. That's because you're a giant, hot-blooded animal that looks like a predator, and you're approaching that animal in a way that terrifies it, and it can't run because it's in a cube enclosure, and so it has to defend itself against you. So that type of behavior is not actually aggression. When you see aggressive behavior in a male retic, really you wouldn't even notice it until it bit you. That's why people get so surprised. Usually what they'll do is you can see them kind of sizing you up, reading you up, and a lot of times what they'll do is they'll cruise along your arm, and they'll be smelling and looking for a good place to stick some teeth, and then they will bite and twist, and their teeth are very sharp, so they slice through skin pretty easily, like effortlessly. So you get lots of little cuts and things from their teeth, but they do have like small needle-like teeth. It's usually not that bad. Any damage that would ensue is if, especially if they cut like a tendon or an artery or something like that. But that's what a lot of people don't realize, that those males will square up against a human male territorially and try to get them away from females. Now, you usually don't see that. If you take a baby snake, I've got one right here. This is actually a year-old pure Superdwarf. But if you and so this one's a year-old, it's better to start with a hatchling. I mean, it looks like a hatchling mainland, but it is already got some age on it. You start with a nice baby from a good breeder. You let them establish it as far as being able to eat. Then you bring it in your house, and you and the snake learn about each other forever. Those first awkward, like teenage years or whatever, might be a little bit awkward, but you just give them the same basic respect. I think sometimes people get a little bit intimidated by their animals, and then they let that animal, change their behavior. Mm-hmm. And just like a dog or a horse or any other intelligent animal that we work with, they'll see that, and they'll begin to dominate you. You've just shown yourself to be submissive to that. And it's not that you're trying to go in and fight. It's that basically you need to communicate the message to the animal that you're not here to hurt it, and you're also not intimidated by it. It can do whatever it wants to you, and you're not gonna care, right? And if you do that, starting from when they're a baby, raising their whole life, you develop a really good, trusting relationship with the animal. You don't really see any issues with that kind of stuff,
Now, about breeding, do retics go into breeding, the breeding season for retics? Is that just time of year? Is that based on day-night cycles, temperature? What triggers that?
With reticulated pythons, generally, we have them breeding with food cycles. So we'll feed them much less during the summer, and then start feeding them more heavily during the winter. The reason why we do that in our winter here is just because that's usually the time when people have cool enough temperatures for viable gametes. So sperm and egg needs to be cool to be fertile, you know. And so working around the cold time of year certainly helps. But that's not what cycles them. You don't hibernate a retic or anything like that. Bring them out, warm them up, and then have them breed. It's just that in conjunction with cool temperatures. If you kept cool temperatures, gave them access to temperatures in the low 70s year round, you can breed them year round, and they're cycled with food. So males are not cycled like that with a female. That is, a female needs to start producing follicles, which develop into eggs that then need to be fertilized or otherwise. The males aren't like that. The males begin to want to breed when they start to smell females.
So. Now, is it just smelling females, or is it smelling females who have follicles and are ready?
Follicles and are ready, yeah.
So it's like a lot of species where they're just completely uninterested in reproduction until the female chemically signals she's ready.
Yep, that's it. That's exactly it. And then things get crazy, so... But, I mean, they're really not. It's people who have never experienced it are intimidated because they hear stories, generally, I think, from breeders who took their animals for granted and, don't pay attention like we are right now, not paying attention to what these animals are doing. You know what I mean? And are just not paying attention to the cues that the animal is giving, that it's uncomfortable with you, or something like that. And they just throw them around their neck the way they always did and run away and get themselves in trouble, so... and then you hear these horror stories happen, and I think it's important with any animal to understand what can happen. And I mean, the big sin is for us to pridefully say that we have domesticated an animal and we can now trust it, or but they are still independent beings. So it's akin to like, you can have had a dog your whole life and everything's been great. But if you have this dog and you bring your new infant child home, you don't want to leave that infant child down on the floor with the dog in the same room and expect the dog to act and react the same way you could be really asking for it there. And a lot of people allow, their kids to be unsupervised around dogs, horses, things like that, to very, very detrimental effects. And so it's important with animals that you always pay attention to trying to read the animal, communicate well with it, see what it's doing. And it's really not any different than having a dog or a horse or anything like that. You just want to be careful and slowly introduce them to new situations, reaffirm the established relationship that you've built with them over the years, that just because, you're a mature animal now, that doesn't change our relationship at all. Just because there's a baby in the house, that doesn't change your relationship with the dog. Just because we're outside instead of inside, that doesn't change anything. And that's part of animal acclimation and good husbandry throughout the course of their life, is continually presenting them to new situations and allowing them to, discover those.
Come on. I know it's a tree. I know.
Got a tree just off stage. The snake's like, woohoo!
I'm sorry, girl.
Hard to resist a nice ficus, huh?
Yeah, I've had that ficus for like 22, 23 years.
There you go. You need to zoom out a little, and then you can do like a between the ferns type of a deal. You got the whole setup here. Yeah.
So actually, brings up because since retics are an intelligent snake.
Yeah.
So would you say it's like with to ask like, are dogs an aggressive animal?
Yeah,
in general,
exactly.
Is a stupid question.
Exactly.
It depends tremendously. I mean, they're a very capable predator, and it depends tremendously on how the dog was socialized.
Right.
Because you can get dogs who you can't go near without getting injured. You can get dogs who are the sweetest thing ever. Mm-hmm. And there's some element of individual personality and an awful lot of how they're socialized. Would you say that's true of retics?
Absolutely. And I really think most pet owners in general have this attitude, whether it's your dog, snake, or anything else, that you're like, hey dog, you're here to please me when I want it, and the rest of the time you need to shut up and get out of the way. You know what I mean? I don't know that that's the right attitude to have towards having an animal. You're taking a different species and sharing your space with it. So it's going to have to learn things to live and work around you and you're going to have to learn things to live and work around it. And I think it's important for us as keepers to try to see the world through their eyes sometimes and think about what it's like. For example, if I come in here and turn the light on and reach in the cage and grab my snake and yank it out, and you're waking it up out of bed and pulling it up out of there and it doesn't even know it's you yet, it seems unreasonable to expect that snake to always react positively to that situation. You know what I mean? Sometimes you're causing it to react before it can think, and that's when you get in trouble. You know what I mean? So it's very important with every interaction that you have that you reaffirm, everything's the same. This is a different situation, and just make sure that you keep everything the same when you get there. So just like when I first pulled these animals out, we just got here. The first time I took this animal out, it's a new room. They don't know this place at all. I don't know if you noticed, but I was kind of controlling the head and keeping that towards me and away from you guys and trying to, just be there with the animal, smelling me, give it something familiar to recognize that while allowing it to explore and experience those new things. And just quickly, but intentionally reaffirming that the relationship is still here. Everything is the same. And we're just going to have a nice interaction now. And once the animal has established that in its mind, then, that's all that it expects. It doesn't expect anything else other than to have a nice interaction. So.
Yeah. Now, speaking of personality, I'm curious in how, because humans aren't the same from childhood to adulthood.
Sure.
Or especially from being a baby to a childhood to adulthood. And I know, like, in some of your videos, you talked about how, like, neonates are just terrified of everything because when you just hatch out of the egg, everything wants to eat you, and you're not really good at this whole staying alive thing yet.
Yep.
So, but that changes, and then somebody, like, over the into adulthood, like, how does especially the dwarves, how does their personality change over time?
Well, aside from every animal being a little bit individual, you'll have some animals that are prone to be more defensive or afraid, and they require more work to establish a relationship. Some animals, no matter how much you work with them, they're going to be like, look, you can stay there, but you can't touch me. You know what I mean? Other animals are more than happy, like, these two girls here, just to come out and play around and curiously explore and see what's up. But in general, the big shift that happens is they gain more confidence as they grow. So just as in the wild, they would be raising up on the food chain, so to speak, there's more situations that a large snake can handle that a baby may not need to. So just their size alone gives them confidence, but then also all of the accumulated experiences that they have in life gives them confidence, just like a skilled worker would. You walk into a job, if you're a skilled worker, and you say, okay, I've seen this situation, roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty. Someone that's new might be like, well, I don't know what I'm doing here. Who am I supposed to talk to? What am I supposed to do? Somebody tell me what to do. And so that's the shift that happens. You have to treat the younger snakes kind of with kid gloves and say, okay, this is what you're supposed to do. Here's where we're going to be. And they might, I'm getting scared. I'll bite you. And you say, no, you're not biting. We're not here to do that. You need to relax. This is not a defensive situation where you need to be like that. This is me, and you need to learn that when you're with me, I'm going to take care of things. So you don't have to worry about any of that. You can just go ahead and have some fun, explore the new surroundings, and see what's up. And as they become more and more confident as adults, that's what shifts. Mm-hmm. So, but the important thing is that your level of confidence is you're always there to be the stable environment for them. So if an animal gets big, or you start to get nervous about it, or maybe, your snake hasn't been startled and given a defensive strike in your direction in years. So you forget about it, and then it strikes at you. It hits the glass as you walk by or something because you startled it, and you get terrified and you come unraveled. That snake is now in all new territory because you've always been there to be the rock for that animal, right? And now you're not. And so that's kind of a scary new thing. It'd be like if you were a small child and you saw your parents terrified of something. That's probably how most people develop their fear of snakes in the first place. And so then that situation becomes scary to them. And so you can actually decrease their level of confidence, which an animal that's not confident in itself does not make a good companion. You want them to be calm, confident, just like these two girls are. I mean, they're so confident in themselves. I mean, I can handle them roughly if I want to. I can turn them upside down. I could literally open their mouths, and they're not going to be defensive because we've been through that before. You know, we've done that kind of thing. So, you know, they've been desensitized to a number of different situations, and they've gained confidence through all of it. So it really makes them great captives when you are that way. But it takes intentionality. And it's a big reason why, you know, especially if you're working with an animal for the first time, I would recommend making sure that it's well established as far as eating well and, you know what I mean, having some level of confidence already instilled by getting it from a good breeder that you know works with the animals like that. And then picking up, you know, grabbing that baton, so to speak, and having them pass that off to you so that you can work with them, become more confident. We will become quickly confident around a small snake like the one we just had out as humans if we're intentional about it. It might take the snake a little bit longer. So you want your confidence level to be a little bit greater than theirs in all situations. You can't let them unnerve you. Otherwise, it's not that they're like, oh, you know, people say they can smell your fear and they're there to always evilly take advantage of your weaknesses. It's not like that. It's you're kind of shaking up what they know to be true. They thought that you were a confident, in control guy, and then they got scared one time, and that terrified you. And now every time you touch them, you're shaky or breathing heavy, and they can tell that you're almost like acting as a predator who's trying to figure out how to grab them, and that unnerves them. And they can have a shift in personality. So, but it's all based on us, not them.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, I mean, it's actually good sense to be wary of somebody who's afraid of you.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
mean, just in human beings, people who are afraid of you are way more unpredictable.
Right. You're very nervous and it's making me uncomfortable, right? Yeah. That's exactly it.
I mean, it's just, in general, that's very practical.
Right. Yep.
Now, speaking of handling, so I know, like, in your videos you mentioned, because you've got a video about, like, how to set up your new snake.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that you want to be, like, you want to take them out, you want to handle them basically till they get, for, like, the neonates, handle them till they're calm, then put them away.
Yeah.
And do that, you know, maybe 2-3 times a day is what I recall you said.
Yeah.
As they get older, like, how much, you know, as they start to get juveniles and then into adults, like, how much interaction, you know, is a positive experience for them?
I think that is something that has to be determined by the animal. I will say one thing I see most people tend to do. They're like, hey, okay, I'm going to hold my snake today. So they take it out, and if they want to have a lot of interaction with their animal, to them that means I'm going to have my snake out for 4 hours. You know, and that's a long time for an animal that is usually an ambush type predator that's used to being confident and in control and in a controlled environment, to be out with everything changing. I mean, they process so much information that's just a lot of information to throw at them. Whereas if you can give them short, memorable experiences, so like I said, when you're handling your new baby snake, rather than take it out for 6 hours and walk around with it in your pocket and watch TV and take it to the mall and show all your friends or bring it to a reptile show with you or something, those are usually very stressful situations on the animals, because after a certain amount of input of information, and we're like this too, if I give you so much new things on your to-do list, by the end of the day you're going to be completely frazzled. That's what you're doing to that animal. But if you can break them down into saying, okay, I'm going to take you out and this is our routine for that, I'm going to handle you and everything is good, see, this is great, and then you put them away, they have one more experience that they can open a new event, you know, like they would on a computer, like they can in their brain. They can open a new event and close it and file it into the positive category. So if you do that 12 times in a day, but it may only be 5 minutes at a time, you've just created 12 new events of positivity for that animal to base its life experiences on. So that's probably a better way to do it, is take it out, handle it. Sometimes they're a little nervous, they don't know what's going on. You handle them until they're acting like this. I mean, look at this girl's just hanging out and chilling. That one was resting on you for a little while. And I probably shouldn't just walk around with her like this for 5 hours, you know. But now that she's like this, I can enjoy it for a few minutes, have a good time with her, maybe take some selfies for social media or whatever, and then just tell her she's a good girl and put her back in her cage and let her rest in her hide box for a while, you know, and go ahead and process that information.
Actually, that reminded me of another question I had, which was, in terms of hiding, like when in like juveniles and adults, do retics still always like to have hide boxes, or they become sort of more willing, since they're bigger and more capable? Are they more willing to just like sleep out?
There are times that they'll use them, and every animal is a little bit different. I'm a big believer in giving them options and allowing them to do that. So just like if I come home from work at the end of the day, I've got 4 little kids, they're going to tackle me, I have to wrestle them for a while, and then I have to listen to, my wife wants to tell me, she's been around children all day, so she wants to tell me every detail of everything that she went through, whether it applies to my life at all or not. So I'm going to let the kids tackle me, I'm going to let my wife talk to me, then I'm probably ready to like have a shower. You know what I mean? And I love that the new iPhones are waterproof because I can set it up and watch a YouTube video about classic cars or something. Just take a shower and have some me time. It's not that I don't like talking to my wife. It's not that I don't love wrestling with my kids. It's just that there's a time and a place for everything. And so giving them a hide, it's critical for a baby, but I think it's very important for an adult as well, because sometimes they just want to be able to sleep peacefully. You know, so if you're in a room where you're turning the lights on and off every time you come out and you're walking around and doing all that kind of stuff, and they're in a big glass front, beautiful enclosure, but you're always bombarding them with light and sound and, you know, movement and things like that they feel they have to wake up and keep an eye on and go back to sleep again. You know, it's not going to be a restful and peaceful environment for them. So just providing a small, tight-fitting, dark hide spot within their cage will allow them, if they're getting tired of you, to kind of jump off into the shower, you know what I mean? Lock the door and have some me time. Oh, girl, you like a little bit of me time, don't you? Yeah.
Now, one thing I've seen too is the idea of having hide spots at different points in the thermal gradient within the enclosure. And I mean, is that still important even for the bigger retics?
I think so, but you can ultimately when you set up the babies, you want to give them as many options as you can. So people that use minimalistic setups, if you're a beginner, the most minimalistic type of setup is not the best idea because you have to get it perfect. You know what I mean? So the temperature has to be exactly right because you have a really small gradient. You know, that hide spot needs to be in the right place because if you put it on the cold end and the animal needs to be hot to be healthy, but it's going to choose safety over temperature, over the long term, that could be detrimental to their health. Maybe they stop eating or something like that. So by giving them options, you're allowing them to take care of themselves in the way that they need to. And then as you become more experienced, you might realize, you know what, this thing never hides on the cold side. My individual snake just doesn't do that. It hides in the warm spot, it comes out, explores the cold, and then retreats back to the warmth. And if that's the case, you know, as they grow and things like that, you can remove those hides and simplify their cage, streamline it to their process a little bit better. But I think there's always less harm in more options than there are in less options. So I would always say go overkill and rein yourself back as you realize what you don't need. Be prepared, though, in the beginning. Don't be unprepared and figure out you need something later.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense.
Yeah.
But this one's just a short question. But because I've read in a number of places that retics have a fast metabolism. Mm-hmm. So, like, what does that actually mean in practice? And, like,
it means they're messy. They're a work hard, play hard kind of a snake. They eat food. They love to eat food. They're very aggressive about capturing their food, which is very fun as a keeper. I mean, you know, don't get me wrong, stay out of the way. But it's really cool to see them do that. And it's, you know, the snakes are not very excitable once they gain that upper level of confidence like these ones are. So it is fun to see them become very excited about something again. And they do that when it's eating time. And they tackle that down and then they process it through their bodies relatively quickly. And then when they're ready to get rid of it, they get rid of it a lot and everywhere. So they're a very, very messy snake. And part of why they're so messy is usually because people are giving them the minimum size cage. You know, so if you think about it, it doesn't seem like it, but both of these snakes that we're holding, they seem like, from a handling perspective, sorry, girl, they seem like comparable to like a ball python. Holding them, they're longer, but they're, you know, these are about 8-foot superdwarfs, 2 adult females. They're both crosses, but they're about ball python size here, and so they're not too big of a deal to worry about. But you could imagine if you set one of these up in, let's say, an 8-foot cage, it's as long as the entire snake, and if you're only going to have a few animals, why not? Give them something that is as long as them and then half as wide, maybe 8 feet by, say 3 feet, and like at least 2 feet high. You're going to have a big, beautiful environment, maybe put some shelves in there, allow for some arboreal activity. When you set them up in a cage like that, they're not very messy because you have this gigantic cage. And the problem is a lot of times people take an 8-foot snake like this and be like, oh, it's ball python size. Let's keep it in a CB70 tub. You know what I mean? That's a foot and a half by 2.5 feet or something. Then the snake has this big stinky turd in there and crawls all through it and rolls around in it and paints the walls and the ceiling. And everyone says, oh, snakes are so messy. Retics are so messy. Some of it is just because they're active and you're not giving them any option other than to live in their own filth. So you'll either have to clean them every day or, get them a bigger cage and then they can stay away from it. And they do. So... but because reticulated pythons in general get so big, that cage size I just described is kind of the industry standard for what people would use for a snake that's 16 feet long, and maybe 150 pounds. And they're putting it in the same size cage as something that I would say is great for an animal like this. But I just don't see the point of joyfully keeping an animal and then giving it the absolute minimum required, and then relying on that 2-hour interaction where you take it out to the park to have your joyful pet keeping experience. I mean, if you treat them more like a fish in a tank, when you set up an aquarium, when an aquarist sets something up, they spend hundreds and thousands of dollars even setting up these beautiful environments. They put these little 99-cent fish in there and watch them explore and see what they do or check out their schooling behavior. For some reason with reptiles, because we can take them out, we feel like they don't need that much. Just stick them in a box somewhere, And it's a lot more fun to watch. I mean, just even as we're talking, hanging out with these girls and watching them cruise around and explore, to get to see them do that on their own, apart from just reacting to you all the time, will really help you learn a lot about your animal.
Yeah, that makes sense. This one's just a real practical question, but when you say that they process their food quickly, how long after you feed them do you wait before handling them again?
Well, I mean,
obviously you'd pay attention, see if there's still a lump and how they behave.
Yeah, that's basically it. If they're stretched out and they have a big solid lump in there, you probably don't want to handle them a lot, because the way that we're handling these girls right now is a little bit like a carnival ride for them, right? So you wouldn't want to load up on food and then go on a carnival ride. It's you're better off just to allow the lump to go away. So depending on the size food item that you give them, I would feed a girl like this something like a big jumbo rat or something, and a meal like that is probably gone, for the most part within 36 hours. It'll be further down our digestive system. So don't handle them through the next day. Feed them in the morning, give them that day off, the next day off, and then handle them and they're fine. As far as gentle handling, it's not like a do not touch or your snake's going to explode or something. If you've got to move them, remove them, and feed the cage, you can do that carefully. Just try to support the body, especially on both sides of that lump of a meal, and do that kind of stuff. But to take them out to, quote unquote, play with us, I probably wouldn't do that when their stomach is full of food. So just uneasy on them.
That makes sense. So to final subject.
Okay.
Is about see, because my perspective is from being entirely on the outside of the snake industry.
Okay.
And so I don't know anybody or stuff. So I found you. I've been enjoying your YouTube videos and so on. But how does starting sort of from the outside, when you don't know anybody and don't know anybody to ask for who are the people you can trust, how would you advise somebody to go about finding a breeder and getting to know them and getting to, in the practical sense of, getting to, where do you look for their reputation?
Yeah.
And
I would say, so, when my wife and I first moved to a place called Huntington Beach in California, We didn't know the area. We didn't know anything. So we drove down there and we saw this nice apartment complex that was beautiful, and they took care of everything for you. It was expensive and it was on the high end, but we knew that we were going to be happy there because they had security at night to keep us safe in case of any bad things. The houses themselves looked great. It was a big professional place. They had a easy fill-in form. If you had any problem in your apartment, you could turn it in. So we went and we had our first experience living in Huntington Beach there. Now, by no surprise, it was possible to find little cheaper things, or occasionally you could find that like barn find gem of property or whatever. But it wasn't until we had already lived in the area for 6 months or a year or something that we're even able to navigate that or understand that. So I would say if you're going to jump into something, go to the best, spend your money well. The old saying that says the sting of good quality only hurts once, right? The sting of bad quality can last a lifetime. And especially if you're talking about an animal that you're buying as a baby that's a super dwarf, and maybe the breeder you're working with doesn't fully understand the ins and outs of selective breeding, or the influences that the different bloodlines have, or maybe they're a little bit foggy on where all their original bloodline came from in the first place. They don't know too many details on what they're working with. It's a pretty good sign that the animal you're buying is a crapshoot. And if they get anywhere from this size up to 16 foot 150 pound snake, that's a very big difference. Most people are totally fine handling an 8 foot snake like this. Whereas something that weighs as much as they do can present a problem. So I would say, go for that nice Huntington Beach apartment. And then we were happier. We found like a quadplex with some friends of ours that we had made that owned this property, and then we lived with them, and the whole situation was different. It was less expensive. They provided less for us, but they had the things that we needed. But if we don't know what we need in the beginning, you should go for all of it. Get every good thing in that animal. So go for the best with your first snake. And I'll just tell you now, these snakes are addictive. You're not going to just have one forever. I don't think I know anybody that has just one super dwarf. They're so much fun to work with. They're so low maintenance and everything that it just makes sense to have more than one. So if that's going to be the case, you can get in the first one everything you think you need, and make sure you establish a higher budget for that. Set it up in the cage with all the options. Do everything 110%, and then you're guaranteed to have a good experience, right? Then you can think, what? Maybe I don't need something that's as small as an 8 foot animal, but I would like something with a little bit more colorful genetics to it. So maybe I can step up to a dwarf and get something that's like a newer morph that's had less time refining it down in size. Or I like this certain breeder that I've been interacting with online as I started out just posting selfies of the animal I did have. I saw some that learned some things. It's like when you buy a new car and you drive it home, you see 10 of them on the way home that, I thought I was the only one that has this cool car, You become more aware after that first one. So just do the first one well. Don't do the first one. Don't be the guy that, sees something impulsively. You have an animal, you hold it, and so you fall in love with a baby snake at a reptile show, and lo and behold, the price tag is just a little bit higher than what you happen to have in your pocket, and the guy who's selling it, who you've never heard of, never met before, never talked to, and don't know anything about, says, I can come down on the price for you today only. Then you feel special, because you have as much in your pocket as the animal costs. You take that thing home and then learn all the reasons why that was a bad idea. Then you have to go back to the drawing board anyways. It would be better off if you selected the ideal animal, learned as much as you can about what that will take, and then get it from the best possible source. So if you don't know somebody that is within the industry, you don't know all the people, just go to the best that you do. You know what I mean? And tell them what you're looking for. Look for somebody that is trustworthy. Look for somebody that's not somebody that is okay telling you, I might not have this animal for you, but I know somebody that does, that can help you out. Or find somebody that has the animal that you want and ask where they got it from. Say, that's the perfect animal. I love that animal that you have. Who did you buy that from? Would you have bought from them again? Would you do anything differently? And there you go. So follow, find what you want. You can either find a great breeder and start there, or you can find somebody that has a great animal as a pet and ask which breeders they would recommend or who they would buy their next one from, and try to learn from other people's experiences there. But the basic idea is you don't know what you don't know. So go to somebody who definitely does. Don't try to figure out how you can make this buying experience work in your favor when you don't know anything about the buying experience or the bloodlines of the animals, or you're new to it and all you know is what you've been able to read online. You have no personal experience. Go with somebody who is willing to work with you to make sure that they have the right thing, not just trying to put the animal they happen to have available at that point in time in your hands. Because ultimately, I mean, these snakes can live 20 and 30 years, so what difference does 6 months make if you have to wait until the breeder has the animal the breeder you want has the animal you want and can place the right one in your hands? Meanwhile, you could set the cage up, get everything ready, you know what I mean, and do some more research and things like that in the meantime. So be patient, figure out what you want and go get that. Don't just say, well, that's here now and it's most of what I want, so I'll get it, because sometimes the things that might be lacking could be big. Those genetics just weren't quite small enough, and lo and behold, you can't feed this thing frozen rats anymore. You've got to find a supplier for rabbits or something like that. It's 10 times more expensive, much more difficult, You don't want to end up in that situation.
Now, speaking of availability, because I know you've got a video from November?
Mm-hmm.
Would it be, I think, where you went through and showed how there are 4 snakes left in your rack? Something like that. I might be slightly exaggerating, it might be 6 or something, but there's not many.
No.
I remember you mentioned you're...
No, November is generally terrible for availability. If we're breeding during the winter, that means the animal's usually hatching in spring.
So if the animals are hatching in spring and tend to be... I'm just wondering, because there is a realistic amount of... If you don't make a decision by here, then you're waiting another...
Yes.
5 or 6 months. So what does that look like? When you're not talking about somebody who's trying to say it's about to go because they want to move the animal they've got right now, but there are actual windows for anyone who's being responsible. So what do those windows look like when you're talking about somebody who isn't just trying to move an animal, but is just being honest about what...
Talking about what time of year should you plan to buy these things if you want to get a baby? Yeah, I mean, the best way to do it, usually everybody wants to get the pick of the litter, right? So you want to be there when the litter happens and be there and know what you want in advance and be able to snatch the best one up. You don't want to wait till November and then be grabbing whatever happens to be left over. Sometimes they're great. The reason why they're left over is because they're very expensive and you're waiting for the right animal. If you watch that video of mine, quite a few of the animals that were in there were like that. But if you want something this girl could be from a fantastic bloodline but be an inexpensive animal as a baby, you want to be there and snatch it up. So generally speaking, the Superdwarf Reticulated python hatching season is the first 6 months of the year. So it's the end of January now. We've just had our first clutch. I have one more clutch that's due to hatch any day. And then I have 8 clutches hatching in February. And every month after that will increase for a while until about June. And then they'll taper off and probably not have anything again until the next January. So, but again, if you can find your way, either find an animal someone likes, ask who they got the breeder from, or find the breeder you like and ask for what kind of animal you want, they'll be able to tell you when they can provide. Just be prepared that, to wait. Ask if you can call them back, ask what the expected due date is and call them again, or if they are willing to put in the effort to have something like a waiting list. A lot of the stuff that I do is on a waiting list. We'll actually send notifications out as the animals hatch to the people that are interested, to see if they're still interested at the time that they actually hatch. So, that's the best way to do it. Just, be prepared to set up your environment, do all your homework, get ready for that animal so that when it comes home, you already know how you're going to go about training it, who you're going to be buying your food from, the temperature ranges within your cages. You're not trying to hurry up and buy a custom enclosure that only to find out that the company that builds those cages has a 3-month turnaround. Now your baby's there, but you're not ready for it for 3 months, So, and then financially, a lot of times when people do want it all, maybe you're thinking, well, I'd like to get away with like a $300 snake or something. But then when you sit down and you list all the criteria that you want out of that snake, you find out the animal you're describing is $1,500. You can either compromise on a snake that you're going to have for 20 or 30 years and give up a few of those things that you wanted. And sometimes, like I would say, like things like color and pattern mutation really don't matter as much. That's lower on the priority. As long as you like the snake that you're getting, I mean, all the different color varieties only serve to help the person buying it like the animal that they got. But things like size and bloodline, maybe the sex of the animal that you want, those might be non-negotiables. So now if you're doing like an investment breeding plan, the color variety may be a non-negotiable. But yeah, if you were thinking you were going to spend $300 and turns out you need a $1,500 one, you can either reconsider having that species because you can't get what you want out of it until you spend more money, or maybe say, okay, well, seeing that 8-foot snake, that's like pretty small. I think I can handle an animal bigger than that. Originally, I was saying I only wanted an 8-foot snake, but looks like if I step up to a 10 or 11-foot snake, I can get everything else I want at the price point I want. So you can make, adjustments or negotiables there. So, but that's going to be up to you, what you really need out of this animal. Some people can't have a 10 or 11-foot snake, but they can have something like this. So you might have to wait for it,
That makes sense. Oh, a question I forgot to ask is how forgiving are dwarf retics and super dwarfs of, how forgiving are they of mistakes in husbandry?
In general, they're very hardy. I mean, they basically most likely kind of somehow rafted to those islands or whatever that they live on and just refused to die. So their bloodline is literally made up of all the little animals that were thrown into a hellish environment and did not die, right? So they're generally going to be fairly forgiving of husbandry mistakes. But because of, again, their character and the lineage of where they came from, they're kind of like jump in and take charge of the environment that they're in, and they will survive regardless. So if you don't do a good job of presenting yourself as a friend and not an enemy or something, they can be a lot less forgiving than that. So a little snake that is constantly defensive or peas and musks all over you because you fail to be able to handle it in a way that helps that animal to calm down. I mean, I think almost any animal, I would say any animal that you gave me as a hatchling, I can grow up to be a very nice snake, but you might need to get an animal from a much more established bloodline that already has some training from a good breeder into it, so that's coming to you with a head start to be able to get that kind of thing. So they're more forgiving of husbandry errors than they are of handling errors. So, for example, if you open that cage and you put a warm-blooded prey item in there and they get very excited and they bite and wrap that prey item before they think too much about what it is, which is something that super dwarves do, and you do that in the same way every time, and then you make a dumb mistake like open the cage and put your own warm-blooded hand in there after handling a rat or something like that, you're gonna get bit by these snakes. And so they're less forgiving in that way. And so in that way they have the potential to make, I know everybody wants to say, is this a good beginner snake? If you've never had a snake and you don't keep them, I would recommend you keep something that is pretty close to the conditions of where you live. So keep a snake that would be basically happy at room temperature in your house, and eats anything like frozen, thawed, readily available food and stuff like that. Reticulated pythons certainly are a more tropical species, and they require, the proper temperatures. That's usually the biggest thing for them, is giving them the proper temperatures so that they can be healthy. If you have them way too hot or way too cold and they can't get away from it, you're not giving them the option, you may have problems. But generally speaking, they're very hardy. Even when those kinds of things happen, they get sick and then you figure out what's going on, you correct it, they'll generally get better. They're not susceptible to things like respiratory infections that you see in stuff like ball pythons. They're very hardy against different sicknesses, against various infections of really any kind. So you have to be pretty intentional about having crappy husbandry and ignore all the videos and things on how to set the animals up and never pay attention to what temperature it actually is in that cage in order to mess them up.
Yeah, because, one thing about temperatures is that, like, I mean, even when you have a temperature gradient, like, it's easy to have, like you really have to use the temp gun all over the place.
Right.
Because it's easy to have temperatures, like, like the temperature 2 inches, up or down is different. And so that's part of it. There's some snakes that are
Well, the people that end up having issues with these are the people who are like, well, I can save money by not having a thermostat to control the temperature and not having a temperature gun to check it. Don't cut those corners. Those are not the corners to cut. Buy a cheaper snake. It doesn't have to be yellow. You can go with the gray one and have a happy pet keeping experience, but you can't, cut temperature control with a tropical species.
Now, in terms of, one thing I'm curious, like, say the power were to go out.
Okay.
For the, like if the power goes out for, say, like, a day.
Yeah.
And it's wintertime. So, like, now, obviously, like, freezing temperatures are deadly. But, like, this is obviously something you have to deal with. But how much of an emergency would you say, like, the power going out for one?
I've had animals shipped to me in the winter that arrive at 40 degrees. And I slowly warm them back up, and they have no ill effects. Now, on the other hand, if I have an animal shipped to me and it shows up at 100 degrees, it could have serious and long-lasting health issues because of that. So cold temperatures they're very cold temperature tolerant for short periods of time. If we walked around outside, we're here in Pittsburgh in January right now, I think it's maybe 40 degrees outside. And we walked around out there for 10 or 15 minutes and came back in and put the snakes away, they'd be fine. They're not going to have any issues with that. So, but yeah, I mean, if you are keeping a cold-blooded animal in your house, I mean, having backup sources of heat and things like that are a good thing. And I think a lot of times people panic in those situations and they figure out, how can I heat this entire cage? And a lot of times all you'd have to do is pull the cooler out of your garage, pop a couple of hand warmers from a sports store in it and stick the snake in the cooler and close the lid. Keep a small warm environment for it until the room temperature comes back on. With mine, all the cages are heated electrically, whether heat pads or lamps and things like that, but then my room is heated on gas. So if I lose power, the gas heat will still keep the room at the low end of ambient and they'll be fine. So that's kind of a nice way to do it if you split most people have forced air, gas heat systems that will still operate even if the power goes out, or if you're on propane and you have a tank or something like that, you may want to have one of those electric room heaters that you can help keep things warm if you run out and you have to schedule the company to come. Having backup systems like that is good. But even if you had to put the snake 4 days in a box like you would ship it in, styrofoam blind insulation thing with a heat pack, it's going to be fine, so.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to have a sense of, because it's relatively straightforward to keep, under normal circumstances to keep the ideal, but life sometimes throws surprises at you, and knowing, like, how much flexibility do you have when life throws surprises at you is also good.
These guys are survivors. They always have been, long before humans had any interaction with them. And so they're pretty good at doing just that. So,
cool. So, any final things we didn't touch on that somebody who knows, is just starting to learn about them should know about superdwarfs?
I would just say if you want to research more and you learn about them for the first time here on YouTube, jump over to Reach Out Reptiles on YouTube. These are all that we do is dwarf and superdwarf retics, and we have something like 150 videos about them. So that's probably currently the largest amassed source of information on these animals as far as all the different bloodlines, how everything works, how to take care of them. You get to see them in daily situations and stuff. And just jump on and start doing your homework, or reach out to me, Garrett Hartle from Reach Out Reptiles.
Yeah, I'll have contact information.
There you go. Contact information below, and ask your questions. Start the learning process. See if it's an animal that would be good for you or not.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having me on.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that as much as I enjoyed being in it. Although that might be hard because, man, did I have a good time. But I had I went as I was going over the video in editing. I had a few other questions that occurred to me that we just didn't get to or didn't think of at the time, which I reached out to Garrett and asked him, and so I'm just going to go over the answers that he gave me to those questions briefly. So the first question I had was, is it possible to choose hatchlings on the basis of individual personality? Because a hatchling is so instinct dominated, can you really, tell very much? Or, being so instinct dominated at the time, does the personality not really come through? And what he said is, on an individual basis, like within a individual siblings within a clutch, not really. They're and now I'm paraphrasing here the idea because I don't remember the particular words Garrett used, but basically that if one seems nippier or more confident or whatever, within a clutch, you're probably just sort of that's what they're like this day. You're catching one on a good day or bad day or something. They're generally going to be pretty similar. And he mentioned that there's a very heavy nurture component to it. That most of the adult retics personality in terms of how calm and unafraid the animal will be about how you raise that from a hatchling. He did say, you mentioned his daughter's lemonade stand business. Is she actually, she has, at the time I'm recording this at least, for $10 fee, she actually will handle your hatchling like 2 or 3 times a day until it gets shipped to you, so that it has a bunch of human interaction and gets used to that before you ever start interacting with it yourself. So it's sort of like off to an especially good start. So that's a cool thing, and definitely if I do get a retic, I'm certainly going for that one. Now, the one thing you can tell different clutches, like all the animals. If most of the animals in one clutch are a lot calmer than most of the animals in another clutch, that probably will be a persistent trait. That will tend to have a lot to do with how long their captive bloodlines are. He mentioned that in the course of breeding, just animals who don't, take to the sort of environment that captive breeding has, to interaction with humans and to, what it's like in a human home and so on, they do better. Like, people like them better, they like to breed them better, but they also just do better. And so they will tend to produce more eggs and so on. And so it doesn't take that many generations. Like, it can, just a few generations away from wild caught to start seeing some real shifts towards animals who do much better in captivity. And that also has a lot to do with, since how well they do in captivity has a lot to do with how stressed they are, that also has a lot to do with how fearful they are, how likely they are to be defensive, and so on. And so those things sort of go hand in hand. So it's just kind of, even if you're not specially selecting for temperament in an animal, you will be accidentally selecting for temperament anyway, just by going with the animals who do well, the animals who produce, larger clutches for you, which is something, a breed would like, and so on. So, in terms of selecting for personality, largely you can do that not by meeting the individual snake, but rather by looking at the bloodlines, how long have they been in captivity, and so on, and a general sense of like, what is the clutch like? So, in terms of, picking out clutch mates, that's mostly just going to be based on like, looks. But, picking out different clutches is largely going to be on the bloodlines, how long have they been captively bred, and so on. Okay, so I asked about when he was talking about the difference in size between males and females. The impression I got from what he said was mostly that he sort of expects males and females to be very similar lengths, but that females will be, definitely girthier, thicker around, and heavier bodied than males. And what he said is that they will tend to be the females will be a little bit longer, because the females will have you need to feed females more. They have a stronger food drive. You need to feed them more. Because they need to pack on weight in order to be able to have so many eggs. The eggs take a lot out of them, as he mentioned in the video. And so the extra food will produce not only girth, but a bit of extra length. And he said that in mainland retics, that the really pronounced size differences you see, that, males generally being, described as like 10 to 12 feet, maybe 10 to 14 feet, and females tend to be like 15 to 20 feet, that a lot of that has to do with the way that people feed them, that breeders, especially because larger female produces more eggs, which is to the economic benefit of the breeder. And so an awful lot of people will really give their female a ton of food, and especially in mainland retics who are more food size determined than are the the small island retics, the dwarf and superdwarf populations, that pumping them full of food to get them size will also tend to increase their length too. Whereas in males, once you get them to an adult size, extra size doesn't really do a breeder any good. And then extra food is just an expense. So they tend to pull back on the food more, which as a result tends to, that is to say, they pull back to just sort of a maintenance level rather than a getting lots of growth level. And so as a result, you tend to see that, the sort of fairly pronounced size differences in large part because of the relative amount of food that the two of them are given. So, again, now remember, it's this complex subject. I'm paraphrasing him. I am going to ask Garrett to look over this to make sure that everything seems accurate. But that was the basis of what he said, and that especially in superdwarfs who have a more genetically determined size, there'll be a bit of a difference because the females still do need more food in order to be able to reproduce. But that said, it's not going to be, that, females are a third longer than males or something. They, as he said, I forget the exact numbers, but it's something like they'll be a little bit longer than males, but they're not going to be wildly different from each other. So, let me see here. Okay. So in terms of, something I was interested in, because I was looking at, like, when he pulled out the yearling, and the yearling was so much smaller. Now, there's a detail in the video that the yearling that he pulled out was a pure superdwarf, whereas the 3-year-old snake that Garrett was holding, the tiger mochino, was a cross. It was a mainland superdwarf cross. So it's a bigger overall animal than that yearling was. But I got interested, like, how fast do they grow? Because that yearling was still really small. And what he said was, it's basically the answer he gave is they tend to grow length pretty quickly in the beginning, and then that slows down, and then they put on, and then their growth tends to focus more on mass. Because if you're not familiar, there's something called the square cube laws, which is as one dimension of something. Like, as a human being grows taller, their surface area goes up with the square of how much taller they are, and their volume goes up with the cube of how much taller they are. So volume grows much faster than surface area, and wildly faster than, like, total size. So in a snake, as it grows longer, you'll get a lot more volume. So in terms of the total amount of mass added to the animal, most of that comes later in life, just because, like, as you get bigger, that's when there's a lot more that's added to get a little bit thicker around. But roughly speaking, you'd expect them to somewhere between double and triple in length by their first birthday. Growth rates vary, but somewhere around double to triple in length by their first birthday. Most of the time, I believe, is closer to the doubling is more typical. Then they'll get, they might put on, another 50% of their length by their second birthday, and then it slows down to be like, very loosely speaking, like 20%, 10% of their additional length. But again, this is where they're going to be putting on those later years with their fourth birthday, their third birthday, fourth birthday, fifth birthday. That's especially where they're starting to really put on most of their adult weight. So they'll be very, the first few years, they'll be a very light snake, and then they'll get most of their, actual adult mass later on. So their growth rate is highest when they're bigger, and which that fits because a bigger animal can take in a lot more food, but it's not really in terms of length, which seems to fit with something I personally have noticed, that length is not a great guide to what a snake is like. You can see a number of videos Garrett talks about where an 8-foot reticulated python will have a very similar mass to, like, a 5-foot ball python. The 5-foot ball python will just be thicker and heavier bodied, and that's probably comparable to something like a 3-foot blood python. Although I don't have direct experience with blood pythons, and Garrett hasn't mentioned. And so, how big is an 8-foot snake? Well, an 8-foot boa constrictor, which they have pretty massive bodies, can be a very large animal, whereas an 8-foot retic is, yeah, both of the animals Garrett and I were holding were approximately 8 feet long, and they were really easy to hold, really easy to handle. They weren't very heavy. Um, they felt relatively small, and so mass has a lot to do with how big a snake feels. Also, sometimes with estimates of length when people give them too. Interestingly. But anyway, that's sort of, the approximate growth rate. So what are you getting into? Well, in that first year, the snake will double or maybe even triple in length, but it'll still be a pretty small animal. And this is in the dwarf and superdwarf, obviously. Then, that second year, it'll still, get significantly bigger, but it'll still be a fairly small animal. And it's really by their third birthday where they start to be more of the larger sort of, in a larger sort of thing where, a yearling, the yearling he held was way smaller than an adult corn snake, for example. And so, it's those later birthdays, really it's around, years 3 through 5 when you start getting a, really, snake that's actually like a large snake rather than a smaller-ish snake. That's by the way, the calling them small versus large is my interpretation of this sort of sizes involved. Now, the actual numbers, of course, will vary because, like, a pure super dwarf will start off in like that 12 to 14 inch range, whereas a super dwarf cross might be bigger than that. And mainlands start off in like 18 to 24 inch range in reticulated pythons, even possibly a bit bigger than that, depending exactly on the individual. And so, if you're going for like the dwarf or a super dwarf cross, then they'll be bigger than that pure super dwarf that Garrett held out. But the general growth rate is still sort of applicable. That they might double or triple in length in that first year, and they'll still be fairly thin and small. Now there's an asterisk too, because mainlands are more capable of just putting on lots of length and size than dwarfs and super dwarfs are, from what Garrett had said. So if you really, really are like power feeding a mainland retic, you can get them to more than you can get them to like easily triple their length in that first year. So that's the basics of about what to expect in terms of like how long do I have to wait to get something at least close to a full-size snake. Because, I imagine most people like me, like if you're getting a larger snake, it's because you want a larger snake. And so, the babies are cute and all, but you didn't get you didn't get a small snake, you didn't get a baby in order to have a small snake. You got a baby to eventually have a large snake. Although with the advantage that you grow, you learn with them. They get used to you when they're still small, and mistakes don't really matter because they're, so tiny. You get whatever mistakes you're going to make in handling over with while they're still small and harmless. And then by the time they're big, then you really have a very good solid sense of what you're doing. But in terms of like how long do I have to wait for the snake to actually be the sort of big snake that I'm hoping to have, that's a sort of sense of things there. Super dwarfs are generally speaking, on a longer time scale from what Garrett said to get to that full size. Okay. So the next question I had was about when a male is defending a female. Because there's a section we talked about that the one time you really expect a retic to be aggressive is when a male is breeding a female. You may recall Garrett was saying, and he perceives another male who is a threat, and he will actually in that case be aggressive. That is, go and attack something, as opposed to typically when people when a retic opens its mouth for something that's not food, it's because it's scared and it wants to scare you off and protect itself, and it doesn't see a way to run away, so it's just hoping to get you to go away instead. And so when you're not talking about the like a fear reaction, which is most of what people see, it's this very specific circumstance, as Garrett said earlier, of a male defending a female that he's breeding with. And he mentioned how, and what he had said is that in this case they give very little warning. And I asked him just to clarify on that, because it's a bit odd in the animal kingdom to go to bite first and ask questions later, when you're doing some sort of defensive behavior. Obviously, a predator will bite first and ask questions later of its food because its whole purpose is to kill food. But when your purpose is just to make somebody go away, it's kind of unusual in the animal kingdom to start off by touching it, because if you can touch it, it can touch you, and that's not a safe circumstance to be in with another wild animal. Way, way, way safer if you could just look scary and make the thing go away. But what's kind of interesting is when you get to conspecific behaviors, that's to say behaviors that are aimed purely at another animal of the same species as you, they're often a lot more subtle. And actually, what I asked him is, like, in dogs. I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead very slightly. And what Garrett said in response to this is that they will try to intimidate first. They don't actually bite for, they don't give no warning. They will try to intimidate, but it's a conspecific behavior, so it's much more subtle. Basically, what it looks like is they'll be very tense. Their eyes will be straight at you. They'll sort of square up. They'll creep forward slowly. And it's a very intense sort of look. And I said, oh, so it's like with dogs. The loud dog is not the dog you really need to worry about. The loud dog's just making a lot of noise. It's the dog who's really quiet. When a dog wants to bite, what they do, their lips come forward just a little bit, and they'll make the very quiet growling sounds, like barely audible, but you have to be listening for it, or at least, if there's any sort of background noise. But they're very quiet, they're very intense, their lips come forward just a little bit, and that's the sign of a dog who's about to bite somebody. And if a dog is doing that, that's a very threatening behavior to another dog. That's saying, like, okay, this is about to get really, really serious right now. But it's a conspecific behavior. That's a message to another dog. That's how a dog intimidates another dog. And so it's a very subtle sort of thing that a dog is keyed into, but doesn't, work generally speaking. So, and what Garrett said is, yeah, actually it looks a lot like that. If you can recognize that behavior in a dog, it actually looks a lot like that in a reticulated python. It's just sort of an interesting subject when it's a specific, conspecific behavior. You can see the same thing in human beings. Like, when a human being is trying to interact with, anything from, like, a baby to an animal, what do? They make big gestures, they make loud noises, and so on. When a human being is interacting, especially like when an adult is interacting with an adult, like, how do they signal displeasure? It's with really subtle movements. Things like subtle eye movements, slight shifts in their tone. It's all very subtle stuff. So it's when there's another thing that you expect to pick up on, the same sort of things that you would pick up on, it tends to be fairly subtle things. This is true in the animal kingdom as well as of humans. And this retic behavior is a very specific one where one male wants another male to not be near the female that he's breeding. It's conspecific behavior, and so it's subtle. And that's what Garrett said. It's a subtle thing, so it's pretty easy to miss. And where a lot of problems will happen is if you get too used to the animal that you don't look out, you don't pay enough attention to their body language. You just go on rote of, like, okay, come here, touch him with the hook, reach in and grab, and don't actually look at the snake to see how it's reacting. Like, that's the sort of thing that will get you in trouble, because they'll give you signals, they'll just be very subtle signals, because this is a very particular sort of behavior. But it is the sort of thing that you can know to look out for, that you can, if you're good about always paying attention, like, don't just go on rote. Respect the fact that this is a living animal who has moods, who has different states, and always look for what is that state, what is going on right now before you start interacting with the animal, before you start pressing things, and you can stay out of trouble. I mean, there's always such things as the freak accident and so on, and no one's perfect, etc. But at the same time, there are some precautions that will do a good job of generally keeping you safe. So that's basically what Garrett had said, with the little commentary sprinkled in for me, of course. Okay. And then the final question I asked him, which I just had forgotten to ask when we were talking before, is there any benefit to the occasionally larger meal? Because, I mean, as we all know, like, at least if you're watching nature shows, snakes are made to be able to eat some pretty enormous things. Constrictors in particular are in large constrictors. And especially reticulated pythons, like, it's relatively easy to get pictures of them with, like, main ones, granted, but with, like, super giant lumps in them from something that was obviously like 2 or 3 times as wide as they are. Whereas the standard feeding advice is to pick something that's about the same diameter as the thickest part of the snake. And so I asked, like, well, is there any benefit to, going to larger meals? Something people occasionally will do, like on Thanksgiving, giving something like an extra large, if you normally feed rats going to a rabbit, or, going to a chicken or a turkey or something for Thanksgiving dinner. And, just that sort of thing. Like, not as a normal thing, but every once in a while, since they're made to do this sort of thing, is there a benefit in giving them that exercise, basically, was my question. And what he said is, there isn't any particularly known benefit to it or good evidence that this is good. But on the other hand, his policy is he varies up both the food size and the food timing because this is a lot more natural. In the wild, dwarf and superdwarf reticulated pythons don't get exactly, the exact same diameter once a week on a regular schedule. And so since they are opportunistic feeders in the wild, they will sometimes get a bunch of food get lucky in fairly short order. Sometimes they'll go a while without getting anything. Sometimes they'll get something pretty big. Sometimes they'll get something small. And so he said he likes to vary all that stuff up just because it's a bit more natural. And so it probably fits better. It'll probably be better for the animal to be closer to natural without... although, I mean, in context, without going to like ridiculous extremes, because it can be natural to, not be able to find any food for a really long time and get in rough shape, and natural in the sense of that sometimes happens in the wild. And just in context, Garrett clearly didn't mean like going to the extremes, just within the sort of normal range of what happens in the wild. That having that sort of variety is the animal is probably adapted to, and so it's probably good for it to have some variety in there, as in food sources as well, because like you can get avian type food sources like quails and ducks and chickens and stuff, chicks, stuff as appropriate to the size of the animal, but like as well as rodents and so on. So you can get a variety of whole foods, and so he said he likes to use a variety of whole foods too, mostly rodents because they're convenient and cheap, but throwing in the occasional thing for variety. So that's the clarificational. Those were the extra questions I had and reached out to Garrett for, and I hope that you found this useful. I learned a lot from talking with Garrett, and myself, I have a much better sense of what it is I'm looking to get into in getting a pet dwarf or dwarf, superdwarf reticulated python, and hope this was useful to you too. Till next time, may you hit everything you aim at.